Welcome to the first audio commentary for strategic management theory and practice. My name is John Parnell. In this commentary, we will talk about Chapter 1, the fundamentals of strategic management. Now, we'll discuss some basic terms and concepts here pertaining to strategy and strategic management. We'll also define intended and realized strategies and explain why the gap between these two approaches creates a lot of importance for the strategic management process. We'll also talk about influences on the strategic management field. We'll define corporate governance. We'll discuss strategic decisions, and we will also close with the global imperative for strategy. Let's start with some key terms. Now, the mission of an organization is a broadly defined but enduring statement of purpose that identifies the scope of an organization's operations and its offerings to various stakeholders. And when we talk about a mission, we are essentially assuming the organization already exists and has some resources committed. Now, this may not sound complicated, but this is a key distinction between strategic management and entrepreneurship. In entrepreneurship, you start with a blank slate. You can create businesses, you can pursue different markets. You don't have substantial resources already in play. When you start with an organization, whether it's a small or a large one, you already have resources committed and you're already moving in a certain direction. And part of that, presumably, is you have a mission. Now, most large companies have a stated mission. It's one that you can often find online. But a lot of smaller companies, even if they don't write one out or they have it published anywhere, they have thought through and there's a general sense of what they should accomplish. If they haven't done that, certainly formulating the mission and thinking about what it is you want to accomplish is a very important first step before you can even think too much about defining or creating a strategy for your firm. Now, by the term strategy, we are referring to top management's plans to develop and sustain what we call competitive advantage so that the organization's mission is fulfilled. So again, strategy is a top management activity. It's something that's done at the top of an organization. And it also is about a plan. It's about steps or activities or things that can be done in the organization so that you can ultimately develop and sustain competitive advantage. What do we mean by competitive advantage? Well, that's just simply a situation where what you do as an organization is creating value for the company, but it can't be easily duplicated by your competitors. Now, developing competitive advantage is not too difficult. Certainly there are ways to figure out how your company can be more successful than other companies, but maintaining this over time or sustaining it is difficult because once you do something well, your competitors can see what you do, and if they can obtain the resources, or whether it's equipment or human resource skills or pursuing a different market or modifying their products, perhaps they can imitate what you do and duplicate that success. So finding a way to develop it in a way, develop competitive advantage so that you can sustain it is the real challenge in strategic management. Well, what do we mean by the term strategic management? Well, it's a broader term than just strategy. It's a process that includes top management's analysis of the environment in which the company operates prior to formulating the strategy, as well as that plan for implementation and control after the strategy has been developed. So another way of looking at this is that strategic management is everything that occurs before the strategy is in place, and it's everything that occurs after the strategy has been developed. So this is essentially viewed as a process, and we can think of it in terms of 5 steps. The first step is external analysis, or looking outside of your company. And here we define the industry. We look at the industry structure and how that structure influences potential profitability for the firm and for the industry. And then we also do what we call a pest analysis. And you may have come across a pest analysis. Sometimes it's called PESTEL, different approaches, but essentially you're looking at the external forces that affect the industry and trying to understand how those forces create ultimately opportunities or threats. We get to the opportunities or threats in a later chapter, certain step 1, we're just trying to gain an understanding of how those factors affect the industry. occurs in chapters 2 through 4. Now, in step 2, internal analysis, we look at the organization and we take a closer look at things like ethics and social responsibility. We think in terms of what we do well, what we don't do well, and try to get a better understanding of essentially who we are if you think of the organization as a person. This is done in chapter 5. Step 3 begins with chapters 6 through 8, and this looks at strategy formulation at the corporate, business, and functional levels. Now, the corporate is the most broad. The business level looks at competition, and the functional levels address areas such as marketing, production, and finance. Now, in chapter 9, the last chapter of step 3, we actually look at putting the internal and external dimensions together and creating a strategy for our firm. In step 4, we look at strategy implementation, taking that strategy, executing it, putting it into practice. This is covered in chapters 10 through 11. And then step 5 is strategic control and crisis management. And this is essentially determining if that strategy is effective, and if not, what kinds of changes can we make. This is covered in chapter 12. Now, there are a couple of foundational concepts of strategy we should define early on. The first of these is what we call the efficient market hypothesis. And this is the idea that all individuals or firms in a market earn the same returns in the long term. Now, a good example of this, if you kind of step a little bit outside of strategy, is to look at investing in the stock market. Now, the efficient market hypothesis essentially says that ultimately all the companies in the end will pursue or earn about the same level of profit. And if you follow this advice or follow this adage in investing, you won't take the time to invest in company A or company B. Why would you want to do that? Just go ahead and buy a mutual fund or some type of index fund and just enjoy whatever benefits the market provides as a whole, because in the long term, all the companies are going to perform pretty much at the same level. Now, if this is true, then strategy wouldn't make much difference. I mean, why would you worry too much about strategy if in the end all companies perform roughly at the same level? Now, there's a second concept here that's important as well. And this is called subjective value. This is the idea that a resource's value differs across firms because it's determined by the individual organization possessing it. And you can think about this from a personal standpoint. Let's just say you have a football. If you're a football fan, if you like playing football, if you like throwing the football with your friends, then that has some value to you, okay? If you don't like football, if you don't play, if you just don't like the game, if you don't toss it around with the football around with your friends, then having a football is of little value. It'll just sit on the shelf. So the same football, the same item, the same product can have two different values to two different people simply because of their own interests and their personalities. And you see this a lot in organizations as well. The same resource, whether it's a piece of equipment or all the way up at the corporate level, whether it's an entire business, it can have different values for different firms. This is why sometimes a firm will acquire a business from another firm. They're willing to pay for it because they believe that it's worth more to them than it's worth to the firm that currently has it. Now, subjective value is very important in terms of strategy because the idea is to be able to obtain the resources that provide your firm with the most value and then put them into practice in a way that creates and ultimately sustains that competitive advantage. One of the terms that we use along the way to illustrate this is the term business model. And this is a simple explanation of how the organization seeks to earn a profit by selling its goods or services. Now, business models used to be pretty simple. You open up a hamburger stand and your business model might be to prepare burgers to satisfy the hunger needs of your customers in a way that they are willing to pay you more for the burger than it costs you to prepare it, the difference being your profit. That's a pretty simple business model, and you still see some restaurants operating on that type of an approach. But many progressive firms devise innovative models, and these extract revenues and ultimately profits from sources that you don't see with your competitors. And sometimes you can redefine an entirely new industry this way. An interesting way of thinking about business models is to look at many internet businesses. Now, in the old days, several decades ago, when you would buy a newspaper, you would pay the publisher essentially for the paper, whether it's a subscription or you buy it from a newsstand, but you're paying the publisher to print and distribute that paper, and the publisher also gets some revenues from advertisers. And of course, the publisher has its own expenses in terms of writing the stories or bringing news in and setting up the newspaper for you. Well, you don't see that today because most people read their newspapers online. In fact, there are still some Wall Street Journal, USA Today that you might see in the United States that are still fairly common, but most newspapers are accessed more frequently online than they are accessed in hard copy format. So if I go to that online site for the newspaper and I'm not buying the newspaper, I'm getting the news free. Well, if I'm getting it free, how does the newspaper pay its costs? Well, the newspaper publisher doesn't have to print the paper, so some of the costs are less, but in many respects, the publisher is earning not just by providing traditional print ads, but is also providing ads next to the articles that I read online. And sometimes those ads actually are affiliated with other internet searches I've done in the past, so that they might be suggesting different types of products or services that I seem to be interested in. Advertisers are willing to pay the publishers for access to their customers. So if you think about it this way, publishers are actually getting the news, posting the news, and providing it free of charge to consumers in exchange for advertisers having the opportunity to provide or obtain access to consumers. And you see a varied form of this business model with Facebook. And if you go with Facebook, you can actually get your own site. It doesn't cost you anything. But yes, it does cost you a lot if you think about it, because there are privacy concerns. Essentially, you're providing data to Facebook, and Facebook is able to sell to advertisers who are willing to pay the costs of for your page in order to be able to provide or display certain ads for you. So these are what we would call progressive business models, and firms that can develop these models and find ways to extract revenue from sources that traditionally are not involved with the business are the ones that are most likely to be successful. So what are the characteristics of a successful strategy? Well, there are 5 that we talk about here in this chapter. And the first is that the top managers in companies with successful strategies typically understand the competitive environment well. They know who their rivals are. They know where their customers are likely to go if they can't be satisfied with their company. They understand the competition. Number 2, they thoroughly and realistically assess the strengths and weaknesses of their company. They don't go around patting each other on the back of how great they are. They're realistic in terms of what they do well and what they don't do well, so they can take that realistic view into strategy formulation. They also make sure the strategy is consistent with the mission and the goals of the organization. So successful strategies are aligned with the mission of the company. You'll also see that plans for putting the strategy into action are designed before they are implemented. When strategies succeed, typically it's not a situation where you agree on a strategy and then you try to figure it out along the way. The notion that you would cross a bridge when you get to it is not a good way to execute strategy. Finally, possible future changes, what we call strategic control, are evaluated before a strategy is adopted. Now, there's no way you can always know the future. Certainly you can predict it, but it's difficult. Nonetheless, you should be thinking about some of the things that could go wrong with your strategy so that you can know what options might be available to you down the road. This brings us to a discussion of what we call intended and realized strategies. These are terms that Henry Mintzberg coined decades ago. The intended strategy is what management originally plans. The realized strategy is what management actually implements. Okay, so the difference here is that You would intend a certain strategy to occur. You design it. You think everything is going to go well, but it never goes as expected. So what is put into action always differs. This creates a gap. Now, this gap occurs for several reasons. One, you can have unforeseen events, things that happen you didn't plan for. You can obtain better information, maybe about your competitors or about the external environment, and you obtain that information while the strategy is underway. You can also simply improve your ability as top managers to assess the environment. You get better at doing strategy. So for various reasons, what you intend to put into action doesn't always occur, doesn't always get put into action in organizations. And this gap is you try to minimize it as executives or as top managers, but the fact that the gap is there, it's always going to be there, and you try to ultimately plan for some strategic control to help you address some of those changes when they become apparent. There's also a debate that goes on about strategy as an art or as a science. Now, from the arts perspective, we can say that environments are difficult to predict these days with globalization and the internet and all this fast pace of change, that strategic planning is very difficult to do, and we're really better off just trying to go day to day and just run the business effectively from that perspective. And we think about what we want to accomplish. Sometimes the best approach is about creativity and innovation. And so we would develop a strategy like a potter molds clay. Now, the science perspective is the one that's most widely recognized in the field, and it's one that we predominantly use in this text. And according to the strategy perspective, strategic managers systematically assess the firm's external environment and ultimately evaluate pros and cons of different alternatives before they formulate a strategy. So there's this idea of going through steps, looking outside, looking inside, formulation, execution, control that we talk about in this in this chapter. Again, the scientific approach is more prominent in this text, but we do bring in an artistic perspective when we get to the strategy formulation stage. So where do we get some of these concepts on strategic management? There are multiple perspectives that contribute to the field. We're going to talk about three briefly. There are perhaps 10 or 12 that contribute substantially, but I think we can make the point by emphasizing three. The first of these is called industrial organization. This is a branch of microeconomics that influences the industry's role in performance of the firm. So if you follow an IO perspective, you view firm performance as being a function of the industry, its structure, how the industry works. The opposite of that, if you will, is what we call resource-based theory. And this says that instead of focusing on the industry or looking at the industry as the primary determinant of firm performance, let's look at the organization. What resources does the organization control? And it's the types of resources the organization has and the ability to utilize and those resources and emphasize distinctive competence that determines which companies are successful. And ultimately we have the third perspective, and it's called contingency theory. Contingency theory is kind of a middle ground between IO and resource-based theory, and this says, it's important that the industry and the external factors are important, and it's also important to look at what your organization brings to bear in terms of resources. But the key driver of firm performance is how you put those two pieces together. It's how one fits with the other. So in certain environments, you might want to have a certain organizational approach, maybe a different approach in another environment. The main issue here, according to contingency theory, is making sure the two fit. So here you have three perspectives. You have IO that emphasizes the role of industry, resource-based, which emphasizes the role of the firm, and contingency theory, which emphasizes how the two are connected. Now, if you apply each of these perspectives to a particular strategic situation or problem, you might get three different answers, and that's okay. The answer to a lot of questions in strategy is it depends. And looking at these three perspectives can help you understand some of the complex issues that you deal with in strategy. Now, we apply all three of these in the strategic management process. The industrial organization theory, or IO, is applied in terms of structure of the industry, and it's applied specifically when we do the industry analysis portion of the external environment. We shift to resource-based theories and start looking at the firm's unique combination of strategic resources when we do the internal strengths and weaknesses. And we ultimately put them together in what we call a SWOT analysis and SWOT matrix, and this is done in Chapter 9. This is an application of contingency theory. One of the concepts that comes into play when we talk about formulating and executing these strategies is that of corporate governance. Now, if you have a small firm, maybe a family-owned firm, the decisions are made by the owner, and it's typically a very simple or relatively uncomplicated scenario for putting a strategy into action. Doesn't mean it's easy, it just means it's simple to understand. It's much more complicated in large organizations, especially public companies, where you have lots of shareholders, lots of owners vying for different types of control. The term corporate governance refers to the board of directors, the institutional investors, that can be mutual funds, banks, insurance companies, anyone that holds big blocks of shares of the company, because these folks are interested in monitoring the firm's strategies to ensure effective management. So if you own 10 shares of McDonald's stock, you're probably not going to be sending emails to McDonald's asking them to make changes in their strategy. It's only 10 shares. There's not a whole lot of influence. But if you own those shares through a mutual fund, then the manager of that fund might control tens of thousands of shares. And for that manager has a lot more influence. So you see that through corporate governance. You can't just, in a public company, the CEO doesn't just simply do what he wants. The CEO has to be responsive to the different groups of owners. In fact, more specifically, the CEO is responsible to the board of directors, and this is the board, this is the group that represents the interests of the owners, the shareholders. Now, the boards consist of officials elected by shareholders who are responsible for monitoring the activities of the organization. Typically not your day-to-day activities, but the broader strategic issues. They evaluate strategic proposals made by top management. They establish a broad direction for the firm, and they determine the compensation for the chief executive. Many boards are criticized for not taking the time and energy to really do their jobs well. And it can be challenging because the board might come together once a quarter and review what goes on day and night for 90 days. That can be difficult to understand all the issues, and you have to rely on what the managers in the organization tell you. One of the concepts that it comes into play in terms of criticisms is what we call CEO duality. And this is when the CEO, the chief executive, also serves as the chairman of the board. And of course, this can be a problem. If you recall, a couple of minutes ago, we stated that the board determines the CEO's salary. So how would you like to be chair of a board that determines your own salary? Sounds like you might have a little bit of influence there. Well, this could be a potential conflict of interest in a lot of areas. And of course, there's that criticism that boards just rubber stamp top management's proposals, especially when the chair of the board is also the top manager or the CEO. Now, the evidence does suggest that many boards are becoming more responsive to shareholders and taking their jobs more seriously. In fact, it's an interesting statistic. If we look at S&P 500 companies, or the 500 largest firms in the U.S. on the S&P exchange, those with a separate CEO and chairman, that percentage was about 30% in 2005. It's over 50% in 2019. So you can see a greater separation there of CEO and chairman responsibilities. There's a lot of legislation that influences how corporate governance occurs as well. One of the most common pieces is the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002. This covers public, not private, firms in the United States. It requires, for example, that both the CEO and the chief financial officer, the CFO, certify every report that contains company financial statements. It also restricts the membership of the firm's audit committee to outsiders, so insiders can't do the auditing. It prohibits firms from extending personal loans to board members or executives. But at the end of the day, this type of regulation is not always effective. And the effectiveness of SOX is widely debated. It's very difficult for a lot of corporations to comply, creates a lot of legal issues, a lot of compliance issues beyond the scope of this chapter. But just note that it is not something that is universally accepted as positive. So what do we mean when we talk about strategic decisions, when we think about the types of decisions that are made by chief executives and boards? Well, there are 5 characteristics that we'll stress here. First, strategic decisions are based on a systematic, comprehensive analysis of internal and external factors. So when we talk about a strategic decision, we're not talking about a day-to-day type routine decision. It's something that you step back and you look at all the factors, because again, this is a top management type activity. Strategic decisions are also long-term and future-oriented, usually several years to a decade or longer. So these are not things that come and go in a few days or a few weeks, but these are decisions that have long-term relevance for the firm. Strategic decisions also seek to capitalize on favorable situations outside the organization. So it's about looking at what's outside and connecting that with what's inside. Strategic decisions are non-repetitive and may lack precedence. And by that, what we mean is you can't just look and see what you did last year to determine what you do this year. The situation has changed. There might be some principles you can carry forward, but every situation is a bit different and requires a completely new analysis. Finally, strategic decisions involve choices and trade-offs. Now, we'll address this issue in a little bit more detail as we go through the book, because some strategies don't necessarily require those trade-offs, or at least minimize the trade-offs, and this is an ongoing debate that we see in the field. Nonetheless, it is safe to say you can't be all things to all people all the time, and strategic decisions take that into account. Just a kind of a closing comment here, a top management team might make a strategic decision. In fact, in most large organizations, the decisions are made by a top management team, but the CEO is ultimately the driver and is held responsible. The CEO is fired when the company doesn't do well, not the top members of the top management team. They might be, but they're secondary in terms of consideration. Well, let's close this chapter with a comment about the global imperative. In other words, a strategy is a global enterprise. Most firms are involved globally to some extent. You might say, well, hold it, my firm's not. I run a convenience store in a small town. Everything is local. There's no global influence here. Well, have you ever looked to see where the products you sell are made? And even if some of the products are made domestically, how about their suppliers? Where did they get their supplies from? There is a supply chain. There is a connectedness that we have globally in all organizations. Now, again, some are more global than others, but we really approach strategic management from a global perspective in the entire book, and use lots of global examples because of that influence that we have from companies and governments outside of our own. Now, the basis for global involvement is what we call comparative advantage. And what this means is that certain products may be produced more cheaply or at a higher quality in certain countries because of cost differences or technology advantages. And this is why you see certain types of manufacturing occur in areas of the world where the cost of labor is much lower. Maybe technology occurs in areas where it's developed. In India, for example, you have a lot of high-tech companies because technology is well developed there and labor costs tend to be a little bit lower. So this is what we call comparative advantage. And this provides the incentive for companies and essentially societies to trade. So I do what I do best and I trade it with you for what you do best. And we both end up better as a result. Now, comparative advantage and competitive advantage are distinct concepts. Make sure that you note the difference between the two. Now let's close the chapter with step 1 of the case analysis process. Now, we talked about a 5-step process in strategic management. Those 5 steps can be further delineated into 25 steps in terms of analyzing a company strategically. So if you do a case analysis, and you'll see case analysis boxes throughout the text, and the case analysis boxes are also addressed in these audio commentaries. This is the first one. This is step 1, introducing the organization. This is a pretty simple step. The others get much more specific and using different tools of analysis. But in step 1, we provide a background information and we create the context for the analysis. Things like when and how did the organization form? Is the company public or private? What's the firm's mission? What's the firm's business model? So in step 1, we want to just get a basic understanding of the company. Now, step 2, we start looking at the industry. That's done in the next chapter, and we start building toward a 25-step model for analyzing a company. Well, this concludes the audio commentary for Chapter 1.